Good evening everyone. Today's DIY is a little more elaborate than some of the earlier DIYs I've done in these last 12 days of Christmas. I'm creating some mini diorama scenes in the clear baubles that I used for Rory's bauble just the other day. Now I wanted to capture some winter scenes, but I was also inspired by Harry Potter as always, and I was thinking in particular about the cutaway scenes where you see Hedwig going over Hogwarts and it's showing that passage of time into spring, and also the deer Patronus in the Forest of Dean in the 7th book. I was going to make it a doe, however when I sketched out I was worried that my skill at making a very tiny deer to fit in this clear bauble was gonna in the end make it indistinguishable from a cow. So I thought I'll go and add antlers just to make it a little bit more clear what I'm trying to show. I know in day 8 in the clay mushroom DIY I talk about how if you're trying to make something really tiny, try and make it from one piece of clay. Now this is true, however in the case of this deer I changed that rule just because I had to make the very thin legs of the deer support a larger amount of clay, the body and the head. And I knew when it was being baked it would have been unachievable to stand it on these tiny legs, and therefore I'd have to lie it on its back, but then when it cooks in the oven it would obviously flatten on the back, and because the entire bauble is clear I want it to be viewable from 360 degrees, and I didn't really have the intention to paint one half of the bauble. I think it could be interesting to paint half the bauble as a scene, but it's just not what I was looking for in this DIY. So I had to use wires, and the figure was so small that a complete armature seemed an excessively finicky task. So instead I used some cut strips of wire for the legs, and I covered them in a thin layer of clay by rolling them gently between my fingers and attaching them to the rough body shape that I'd made. The figures I depicted in clay were both very simplistic. I wanted this kind of idea of the animal because I knew it'd be quite small, and I kind of doubted how much detail would both look good and that I could actually achieve. So I just focused on the key sculptural body shapes of those creatures. No eyes or colour, I wanted them to be these almost white baubles, really restrict the colours. Now once the head was formed, I again stuck a strip of wire into it and attached it onto the body piece. I rolled warm clay into an extremely thin sheet, and then I cut off small amounts and placed it over the key seams between the clay parts. Honestly, when it comes to clay, it's all kind of a natural skill. Or at least I found it to be. You just play around with this lump of clay and sometimes you'll end up with this really interesting shape and you think, this kind of reminds me of where I was going, and you just have to work from there. To be honest, often you end up overworking if you carry on from that point and end up ruining it and having to start all over again. Sometimes, and I think this is very true of sculpture work, and this is why I'd probably recommend it if you've never done it before, is it's about accepting that by chance you might have found what you were looking for, and just carrying on from there to the next point, just accepting it and working on to the next part. It's just a very freeing art expression, I guess. I don't know, kind of like with painting the impressionistic art in the drawing requests, I feel like this is kind of an extension of that. So yeah, I do really enjoy doing some sculptural work for these DIYs. As I said before about wanting the stag shape not to be flat on the back, the way I did this was by exposing the wire at the bottom of the legs of the deer I'd made. And this obviously reduced the height of my deer. I should have made the wires longer to really capture the correct scale. However, I knew it was going to be mostly obscured by a few things I had planned later, so I didn't really mind. So what I did was I poked these wires into a somewhat flattened ball of clay. I used the clear bauble to get the rough shape I wanted, and this created a stand which allowed it to stay upright in the oven and not deform the shape I'd been working on for so long. I also added a sheet of clay around the deer and began positioning wires that were going to later become trees and a forest that would surround it. The reason I did this before baking, even though I'll have to take the wires out obviously to make the trees later on, it means they'll stand roughly in the position that I want them to be. Well, luckily for the Hedwig owl, I didn't have to worry about the pin legs of the deer, and I could stick closer to the ideals I mentioned in the clay mushroom DIY. I wanted as few pieces as possible, and I kept the wings and tail feathers as just 3 separate pieces attached to the central body part. Again, I'm keeping the forms simplistic and all white as I want the balls to try and appear like a matching set. I wanted to hang the owl from a wire or string so that it'd fly through the forest rather than stand in it for the scene, so I attached an eye pin onto the back. I used my clay knife to score some feathers onto the wings, and I rolled the edge of the clay tool to attach the wings and tail securely to the central body part. It's better to do this quickly when you know both clay parts are still warm, so that the bond is a lot stronger. When ready, get them into the oven and bake them as always, following the instructions of the clay that you're using. When out of the oven, I wanted the colour to stay this bright white on the clay, and no matter what, I always seem to get imperfections from the surface I work on, especially as this clay gets so thin at times as well. You can sometimes see this faint grey of the wire beneath. So just like the mushrooms, I did the same idea. I did a very thin coat of white paint before layering 3 more thin layers of paint over the top. Now once you're happy with the little sculpts, it's time to make some trees. This is actually something I did a lot while I was back in uni. I had to make site models for my buildings to sit in, and as I didn't have any money back then, or now, to tell the truth, I used sponges to create the foliage. Now what you do is you cut the scouring part, the green side, of some sponges. I got a pack of 20 for like 80p in Wilko's if you're interested, and to be honest, they're alright for some cheap sponges. Rip the scouring pad off, and depending on how much you really care about it, cut off any of the remnant sponge on the other side that stayed there. Now you want to cut these into small thin strips. Next, again, get your dexterous fingers warmed up because it's going to get fiddly again. This time with some scalding hot glue to add for a bit more extra danger. What you're going to need to do is put a little nib of hot glue onto the end of one of the wires you stuck into the clay earlier, and stick the end of a strip sponge at an angle onto it. It's only going to take a few seconds to fully dry. Then add more glue to the wire stalk and then begin wrapping the strip around the wire quite quickly. To be honest, the sponge is a good enough insulator that at most you'll probably just feel some of the remnant warmth through the sponge that you just wrapped on, but obviously be careful. I'm trying fruitlessly to protect myself from the blame of when you burn yourself on this stuff. It's fiddly, but just take your time, you'll be okay. You'll be alright. Now repeat for as many trees as you want to make. I wanted some for both of the scenes, so that ended up being a lot of trees. Because they look a little bit naff at this stage, you can begin adding the details. Now I went for an extremely snowy set of trees for the deer Patronus. I lightly dry brushed the trees with some acrylic paint and dipped the tops into that same white paint to give the idea of snow. I also dusted some of this white glitter again that I've had all the way through these DIYs to try and just make it reflect more light and add a little bit more texture to the paint. With the trees for the owls scene, I used a dark green paint first to cover any still exposed sponge, and then I gave them a lighter dusting and dip into the white paint to create the snow. You can turn the trees into whatever you want. These will all pretty much make you mostly thin pine trees, but if you rip off some sponge and you roll it into a ball, you could just add glue to the tip of the wire, stick it into that ball and create a round tree. You could add colours onto it for fruit, you can make them oranges and browns and reds if you want autumn trees. There's so many options that you can do by just taking this form of texture and just building up whatever you want. So I really think that this part of the DIY could really be pushed into lots of future projects. I added some of the sponge onto the bottom of the clay too for the deer scene. I wasn't really sure how well it was going to fit into my bauble, as I couldn't obviously cook them in the bauble. I thought the clay shape might change a bit, so the sponge allowed me to fill in some of those gaps that might have appeared later on without being obvious. When placing the wires back into place, I forgot which were which, but to be honest, it's all the same thickness of wire, you don't have to worry too much. Because the hole already exists, I was able to just add a bit of strong PVA glue to the end of the wires and stick them all into place and just leave them to dry. To make the land that would be sitting underneath Hedwig, I wanted to give this idea of making the world look very curved, as if you're looking at it from above, so I wanted to show a lot more land than I did in the other case. I cut some green felt into these rough, choppy shapes and stuck them all onto a rough oval piece of felt the same colour, and I kind of crushed it as I was gluing the pieces on to try and add a bit more shape and texture to it. I cut a bit of sponge from the leftover sponge earlier to stuff this felt and added more felt underneath to just create this little blob cushion almost that was going to be the land beneath the owl. Once it was dry, I kept crushing it, just trying to get a more interesting shape. This time I did use the hot glue gun, as these trees were going to have to stand into the sponge and I didn't want them to bow too much. I wanted a little bit of movement to try and mimic the curvature of the ground, but I didn't want them to be falling over inside the bauble afterwards, so I glued those into place and began adding the very finer details for these baubles. To create snow, I cut some white felt into really small pieces, just cutting strips and then across those strips again, just to get all these tiny little squares of felt. And wherever I wanted the snow on the two landscapes, I just added more of that strong PVA glue and just picked up this tiny piece of felt and just pressed them in places and sprinkled them over so that they could catch the glue and just start creating a bit of that scene. I added them around the edge of the clay of the white deer too, just because I wanted the break from the sponge to the clay to be a little bit softer. I wanted to break that texture barrier a bit. Lastly, I wanted to give the effect of snowdrifts. This is what I was referring to earlier by partially obscuring the scene. I took the white wool roving I used for felting and pulled it into thin sheets. With these strips, I laced them around the trees and ground to give the effect of some softly moving snow. I tried to achieve similar in the owl bauble. This time I raised them slightly off the ground to give the idea of clouds. The final fiddly part of this bauble is assembling all these parts that you've made all together without making a big mess. I used the hot glue gun on half the bauble where I wanted the base to be and positioned the deer base into it. I didn't want the front view of the deer to be obscured, so I tried to make sure that the seam didn't line up with it. Next, I held it on its back and I just sprinkled a lot of the white glitter that I had into the bottom of that bauble. I wanted it to be almost like a snow globe. I wanted it to move around a little bit inside the glass when it was all sealed. I used the strong PVA again to seal the two glass sides of the bauble together because the hot glue I think would have been too thick and wouldn't have created a nice seam. I put a thin layer around the rim of the bauble and slotted them together. With my leftover sponge, I cleaned around the edge of the bauble just to make sure it was all clean and then used some washi tape to keep the two together while it dried. The owl was even more fiddly. It's a shame because I have this clear thread that you can get from I think like a haberdashery or a craft store, but I couldn't find mine, so I had to use some embroidery thread. I used some blue just to mimic the idea of a sky, and I didn't like how it was hanging the first time I tried it just from the eye pin, so I used some hot glue to put the thread into the exact place I wanted it to be and then painted the glue white just so it wouldn't be as obvious and catch your eye. To be honest, I wish I'd gotten a happy medium between how it was hanging on the eye pin and how it ended up, but you know, it seems alright. And again, I fixed the base into place with the hot glue gun on half the side, filled with glitter, and then put both seams together, holding in place with washi tape and cleaning up with the sponge. I'm really chuffed with how these turned out. They weren't exactly how I imagined, but that's just how it is sometimes, I guess. The glitter seems to have mostly stuck to the outside of the clear bauble, which has ended up giving it almost like a starry night look rather than snow, which I kind of like, to be honest. So yeah, I think it ended up working out in the end. I feel this might look a little unachievable, this DIY in places, or I have the feeling it will when I look at the footage properly. But really the hardest part was making those clay figures. And if you wanted to go along this route with your own idea, you could always get miniatures of the figures that you're interested in. Say the type you see for paper craft, or little charms you might see for jewellery, or even little toys made of plastic. Any of these you could repurpose in these clear baubles, and I think you could create something really interesting. So you're not held to these ideas. I like to think that these DIYs are something that you'll be able to see ideas from and they inspire you into your own projects. Well, that's what I hope they'd be anyway, I guess. I hope you're all doing well and see you again tomorrow for the last day of Christmas, or my last day of 12 days of Christmas. I'll see you then.